In the flickering candlelight of crumbling castles and beneath the shadowed arches of throne rooms draped in velvet and iron, the medieval world bore witness not only to the grandeur of chivalry and the splendour of pageantry, but also to the haunting legacies of kings whose reigns were soaked in blood, madness and ruin, monarchs whose names echo through history with a shudder rather than a cheer, and whose crowns weighed heavy not with duty but with tyranny. Imagine a world where kings ruled not by the grace of God, but by the terror of their whims, where the divine right to rule became a license for cruelty, and where the very subjects meant to revere their monarchs instead prayed for their deaths in whispered tones behind shuttered windows. A world that gave rise to men like King John of England, whose very name inspired the barons to rise in revolt and force from his hand the Magna Carta in 1215, not out of noble political foresight, but because his rule had become unbearable, his taxes crushing, his arbitrary justice unpredictable, his wars reckless and lost, and his personality vindictive to the point of paranoia. A man who starved his opponents to death in dungeons, seized lands on a whim, and was rumoured to have murdered his own nephew Arthur of Brittany in a drunken rage, all while losing Normandy and much of the Angevin Empire, making enemies not just among his nobles but with the church itself, resulting in excommunication and a nation placed under interdict, a spiritual darkness that mirrored the political chaos of his rule. And yet John was only one of many such tyrants, for far to the east, in Hungary, there ruled Ladislas the Posthumous, a king whose unfortunate early death was perhaps the only mercy he ever knew, as behind him came Vlad III of Wallachia, later known as Vlad the Impaler, whose cruelty transcended politics and veered into the realm of psychotic theatre, a man who impaled entire villages on sharpened stakes and left their corpses rotting in the sun as warning to his enemies and his own people alike. A man who dined among the impaled and dipped his bread in their blood, all under the twisted guise of justice and statecraft, and yet who became a folk hero to some for his resistance against the encroaching Ottomans, his savagery lionized by those who preferred terror to foreign domination, even as his legend gave birth to the vampire mythos that would long outlive him, while in Norway, Eric Bloodaxe carved a similarly bloody path through his realm, having gained his name by butchering his own brothers to secure his claim to the throne, his reign marked by pirate raids and such overwhelming violence that his people eventually exiled him, sending him to die a mercenary's death in Northumbria, a king more feared than followed, a lord of slaughter rather than a shepherd of men. And then across the sea in Scotland rose the figure of King Macbeth, not the tragic Shakespearean hero, but a real ruler whose seizure of the throne, through the murder of Duncan, I set off a chain of events drenched in familial betrayal and cyclical vengeance, though in truth his rule was more stable than the histories suggest. It was nonetheless born of regicide and carried the stain of ambition run red, and still worse was yet to come in the madman reigns of Charles VI of France, known pitifully and terrifyingly as Charles the Mad, a king whose mind unravelled like rotting silk, who believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, who sometimes forgot his own name or ran screaming through the corridors of his palace, stabbing his courtiers in delusional fits, abandoning France to internal collapse during the 100 Years' War, a kingdom whose fate was held in the trembling hands of a lunatic, leaving his wife Isabeau of Bavaria and brother the Duke of Orleans to play a deadly game of regency that led to civil war, the rise of rival factions like the Burgundians and Armagnacs, and paved the road for English invasions under Henry V, as France found itself leaderless, mad-led, and broken, and as one stares across the patchwork of the medieval continent, other tyrants loom just as large, like Peter of Castile, called Pedro the Cruel, or Pedro the Just, depending on which side of the blade you stood. A king who kept order by orchestrating a reign of terror, executing nobles without trial, suspected of murdering his own wife, and known to have tricked and then slaughtered guests at feasts in elaborate traps, even as he combated the entrenched corruption of Castilian nobility and tried to impose direct royal control, a paradox of monstrous justice that made him feared but also admired by some for punishing aristocratic excess. His downfall came at the hand of his half-brother Henry of Trastamara, who called him a devil in human form and killed him in personal combat, ushering in a new dynasty atop a mound of corpses and bitter memories. Yet Spain was not unique in producing such despots, for in the Italian peninsula, tyrants multiplied like dark flowers in springtime. Men like Ezzelino da Romano, who ruled Verona with such unparalleled sadism in the 13th century that even Dante placed him in the seventh circle of hell, his crimes including the mass execution of prisoners, the burning of entire cities, and acts of cruelty so extreme that contemporaries whispered he was the spawn of a succubus. And if we peer north to Germany, the Holy Roman Empire gave us Frederick the a man so brilliant and tyrannical, he was called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, yet whose conflicts with the papacy and relentless centralization sparked wars and excommunications, a ruler of immense intellect who conducted grotesque experiments on humans, ordering infants raised in silence to see if they would develop natural language, and who maintained a harem of Saracen assassins and sorcerers at his Sicilian court, as obsessed with knowledge as he was with domination, crafting an empire through cunning, cruelty, and calculated rebellion against both Pope and tradition, while farther north, Christian II of Denmark, known also as Christian the Tyrant, left an indelible mark of horror on the annals of Scandinavia when in 1520, under the guise of celebrating his coronation as King of Sweden, he hosted a feast in Stockholm and then ordered the arrest and execution of over 80 Swedish nobles and clergy in what became known as the Stockholm Bloodbath, a slaughter that shook the Nordic world and ignited rebellion that would eventually shatter the Kalmar Union, earning Christian exile and infamy, a king remembered not for governance but for betrayal, and not to be forgotten was the cruelty of Richard III of England, whose short but violent reign remains shrouded in suspicion and mystery, most notably the disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, a crime that history has pinned upon him, though some dispute it, yet whose rise to power was undeniably soaked in manipulation, usurpation, and bloodshed, his rule lasting only 2 years before he fell at Bosworth Field, his corpse hacked and buried beneath a parking lot, a fitting end to a ruler whose ambition and paranoia overthrew the natural order of succession, and though the Wars of the Roses that bracketed his reign produced much evil, his was a particularly spectral presence, looming long in the national memory as the archetype of the hunchbacked villain, even if Shakespeare exaggerated his deformity for theatrical flair, and in Eastern Europe, even the Terrible, while technically from the early modern period, carried on the medieval tradition of mad monarchs with fervour, reigning over Muscovy with a reign so brutal it echoes in the Russian soul to this day, a man who beat his own son to death in a fit of rage, who organised the Oprichnina, a secret police force of black-clad riders who terrorized the countryside, razing cities, torturing nobles, and murdering entire populations in paranoid purges, a Tsar whose court was ruled by dread and whose mind unraveled under the weight of his own power and loss. And as we reflect on these kings and the havoc they wrought, we are left not with simple tales of villainy, but with a tangled web of human weakness, ambition, madness, and fear. For few of these men set out to become monsters, but the throne warped them, or perhaps revealed what was always hidden within, and the medieval world, with its lack of accountability, its divine justification of power, and its chronic instability, created the perfect crucible for cruelty to thrive. For when a man wears a crown unchecked by law or morality, the line between king and butcher becomes vanishingly thin, and though time may smooth their portraits and embellish their legacies, the people who lived under their rule knew them not as rulers, but as nightmares in flesh, their lives scarred by taxes, war purges and executions, their towns crushed beneath castle stones and their children buried in mass graves, while the kings who wrought such ruin dined on silver and slept on ermine, until death took them too, leaving behind only stories, warnings and bloodstains that the centuries can never quite wash clean. Yet the bloody tapestry of terrible medieval kings continues to unravel, its threads soaked in violence and betrayal, its warp and weft woven by men whose reigns inflicted misery on those beneath their rule. And if one peers across the Channel into the lowlands of Flanders and Brabant, or the jagged kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire, one finds a glut of regional despots whose power rested on local cruelty rather than imperial grandeur, such as Wenceslas I of Bohemia, a king born into the luxury of Charles I's empire, but who squandered all goodwill through laziness, paranoia, and bouts of violence that spiraled into revolt and national instability, ruling at a time when the cracks in Christendom were widening, and instead of guiding his people through the schisms of the church and the rise of reformers like Jan Hus, Wenceslas chose drunken isolation, vengeance, and the persecution of his critics, imprisoning clergymen and alienating both nobility and commoners alike, until he was deposed not once but twice, the last years of his life haunted by the ghost of his own irrelevance, as the empire that could have flourished under his guidance instead festered in division, and even in the far north, among the pine forests and fjords, cruelty found its throne in men like Magnus IV of Sweden and Norway, whose ineptitude and delusions of grandeur caused national unrest and ultimately led to civil war and his drowning at the hands of former allies turned captors, as kings in Scandinavia often ruled by holding together loose coalitions of warlords, earls and nobles, and any show of weakness, especially arrogance without the strength to back it, spelled doom not only for the monarch, but for the fragile peace their crown once enforced, and moving south again to France, long before Charles VI descended into madness, the Capetian and Valois kings had produced their own strains of brutality, none more calculated and cold than Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, a man whose face bore a mask of icy beauty, while his heart beat with the rhythms of greed and ruthlessness, orchestrating the downfall of the Knights Templar, not out of piety or justice, but out of a deep need to seize their treasure and silence a powerful organization he could not control, arresting them all on a single day in 1307, torturing them into false confessions of heresy and immorality, and burning Grand Master Jacques de Molay at the stake, all while consolidating royal power through an increasingly bureaucratic monarchy. And though many admire him as a modernizer, his reign cast a long shadow of fear, suspicion and betrayal over the church, culminating in the violent humiliation of Pope Boniface VIII, who was kidnapped and slapped by Philip's agents in an event that symbolized the raw contest between monarchy and religion, a contest that would see France powerful but spiritually adrift, and elsewhere in the Mediterranean, tyranny took the form of absolute egomania in the likes of John II of Aragon, a ruler so consumed with securing his line of succession that he launched a war against his own subjects in Catalonia, whose reign is remembered not for prosperity, but for famine, unrest and internal decay, a king whose obsessive need to dominate led to decades of conflict that weakened the Iberian kingdoms just as they were on the cusp of forging the global empires of the early modern era, while across the Channel again in the British Isles, another horror bloomed in the form of Athelred the Unready, an Anglo-Saxon king whose name has long been interpreted as a misnomer, for it did not mean he lacked preparation, but rather that he was ill-counselled, a fate that mirrored the actual cause of his disastrous reign, where advisors and court factions manipulated the crown to their own ends while Danish Vikings ravaged the English coastlines, and Athelred's response to this existential threat was to panic, vacillate, and ultimately order the infamous St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, in which he commanded the slaughter of all Danes in his kingdom, including women and children, a horrific act that only invited greater vengeance from King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, and eventually led to Athelred's exile, his crown passing to foreign hands, his legacy one of cowardice and cruelty without purpose. And one must remember that such monstrous kings were not always born monsters, for some were twisted by the crown itself, the endless paranoia of rule, the isolation of court life, and the constant need to maintain dominance over nobles, clergy, and peasants alike, which often bred desperation, suspicion, and ultimately tyranny, and no story exemplifies this better than that of Sancho IV of Castile, whose rise to the throne came through murder, betrayal, and the undermining of his own nephew's claim, a king who ruled with an iron fist and a relentless vengeance toward all who questioned his authority. Even if his reign brought temporary stability, it was soaked in the blood of family, and he died young, having made more enemies than allies, a pattern echoed across kingdoms where succession disputes often led to bloody civil wars, with entire branches of royal families wiped out in purges designed to secure a single heir's fragile claim to power, as seen again in the Byzantine Empire, a realm still clinging to the legacy of Rome, where emperors were deposed, blinded, or murdered with such frequency that palace intrigue became more dangerous than open war, with emperors like Justinian II, who upon regaining the throne after being overthrown and mutilated, exacted vengeance so brutal that it shocked even his hardened court, ordering mass executions, tortures, and public spectacles of suffering to demonstrate his restored power, turning the imperial palace into a torture chamber and the streets of Constantinople into a river of blood. And in the same tradition, Andronikos Akomenos rose to power through seduction and conspiracy, only to rule with such savage tyranny that even the usually passive Byzantine populace eventually rose in revolt, tearing him apart in the streets with their bare hands in one of the most gruesome royal executions ever recorded, an end that mirrored the kind of suffering he had so casually inflicted. And though Byzantium was often considered more civilized than its western neighbors, its politics were arguably even more brutal, cloaked in court ritual and theology, yet as deadly as any Viking axe or Frankish sword. And to the east of Christendom, in the realms influenced by both Mongol and Islamic traditions, rulers such as Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, embodied the archetype of the medieval tyrant on an imperial scale, launching campaigns of conquest that left pyramids of skulls in his wake, destroying entire cities in Central Asia, Persia, and India, not merely for political control but as acts of sheer terror, a man who revelled in the spectacle of annihilation, whose name alone caused cities to surrender rather than face the horrors his armies inflicted, his court, a paradox of Persian poets and Turkish torturers, where high culture coexisted with barbaric cruelty. And if one thinks such tales are exaggerated, they need only look to the chronicles of Damascus, Samarkand, or Delhi, which record in pained detail the waves of murder, fire, and enslavement that followed in his wake. And yet Timur claimed to be restoring the Mongol legacy, a warped echo of Genghis Khan's empire transformed into an abattoir of fear. And elsewhere, in realms now forgotten by the grand arc of European-centered history, petty kings and chieftains ruled with similar disregard for life, such as those in Ireland during the endless interclan wars of the early medieval period, where kings like Diarmait mac Mael na Mobbo waged wars so incessantly that his ambition fractured any chance of unity for generations, while in Wales, the endless squabbling of minor kings ensured foreign domination, and in Brittany and the fractured duchies of the old Carolingian Empire, Counts declared themselves kings and crushed peasant uprisings with fire and rope, often hanging hundreds at a time simply for refusing taxes or resisting forced conscription, their atrocities forgotten only because they wielded power on a smaller scale than the crowned monarchs of England or France. Yet to their people, their cruelty was just as real, just as devastating, just as total, and all across the medieval world, the institution of monarchy, though sometimes benevolent in theory, far too often served as a veil for the most naked expressions of domination, a system in which power was inherited rather than earned, in which the divine right of kings protected monsters as often as it protected saints, and in which there were no mechanisms for accountability beyond rebellion, exile, or assassination, and the people, the peasants and serfs who worked the land, the merchants and craftsmen who filled the towns, the monks and nuns who copied holy texts by candlelight, they suffered the most, living at the mercy of men who could raise their village on a whim, or demand their sons for war, and their daughters for courtly pleasure, kings who believed themselves above the law, and often above God, their sins written not just in chronicles but in scars across the land itself. And while history may remember their names with a kind of grim fascination, the truth is that they were not merely terrible rulers, but also destroyers of lives, and the medieval period, for all its tales of gallantry and faith, was in many places and under many crowns a time of fear, oppression, and arbitrary violence, where the worst men often rose to the top, and once there, ensured their legacies would be carved into stone not with honor, but with blood. And the tale of terrible medieval kings stretches still further, like a long shadow cast over centuries of suffering, for while the grandeur of tapestries and illuminated manuscripts might suggest a world of piety and princely glory, the truth is that for every noble ruler who sought justice and peace, there was another who turned his realm into a forge of torment, a throne of skulls where mercy died screaming, and among these lords of horror we must not forget Louis XI of France, known as the universal spider for his penchant for deceit and manipulation. A king who wove conspiracies across Europe, turning brother against brother, prince against noble, bishop against knight, a sovereign who maintained secret prisons and chambers of torment where enemies of the crown were subjected to oubliettes and iron cages, such as the infamous fillets, cages so small they contorted the body in permanent agony, while he publicly played the part of the pious reformer, using cunning more than steel, but achieving terror all the same. And though his reign consolidated France and ended many of the internecine wars that had plagued it, it did so at the cost of all trust, as no oath or treaty with Louis was sacred, no promise inviolate, for he ruled by treachery and ruled well, which in many ways made him all the more terrifying, as the people could not even take comfort in incompetence. And farther south in Naples, Ferdinand I Ferrante of Naples, though lesser known, built a reputation for cruelty so refined that it became grotesque art, maintaining a macabre collection of mummified enemies whose preserved faces adorned his private chamber, a grim reminder to visitors and courtiers of the fate that awaited betrayal, a monarch who used poison as policy and false pardons as bait, executing nobles in staged reconciliations before displaying their corpses as a warning, turning the court into a hall of ghosts and suspicion. And though he promoted learning and Renaissance culture, his rule bore the stench of quiet terror, of velvet gloves soaked in blood, and this duality, patronage and persecution, civility and sadism, was not rare in these centuries, for the medieval crown often fostered the most extreme contrasts, where the same man who funded churches might also burn villages, where one who kissed relics and financed abbeys might torture children of rebellious barons, and in England this contrast found one of its most chilling expressions in King Stephen, whose reign during the period known as the Anarchy, 1135-1154, turned England into a battleground of lawlessness, as barons ran riot, castles sprang up without sanction, and peasants were extorted, raped, and enslaved with impunity, while Stephen proved unable or unwilling to control the chaos, a king whose weakness made him terrible in a different way, not through action, but through neglect, allowing cruelty to bloom like a fungus in every corner of the kingdom, with chroniclers like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle writing that Christ and his saints slept, a haunting phrase for a time when faith offered little sanctuary from the horrors men inflicted upon one another under the pretense of loyalty and inheritance, and still more terrifying perhaps were kings like John II of France, who while not as bloodthirsty as others, led with such staggering incompetence that his kingdom fell into deep despair, ransoming himself at England's mercy during the 100 Years' War, while the common folk shouldered the financial burden of his mistakes. And worse still was his son Charles V, who, though later remembered for reform, initially stood idle while brigands and mercenaries, free companies, ravaged the countryside unchecked, laying waste to entire provinces, and even more tragically in Castile, Henry IV, known as Henry the Impotent, presided over one of the most humiliating and unstable courts in all of medieval Europe, a monarch mocked by nobles, cuckolded openly, unable to produce a legitimate heir, a man whose weakness led to civil war, fratricide, and the brutal ascension of Queen Isabella and Ferdinand, whose reign of religious purging, crusade, and the Inquisition would be born from the ruin he left behind, and across the various duchies and micro-kingdoms of the Germanic lands, tyranny flowered not just in bloodline but in bureaucracy, where electors and margraves like Albert the Bear enforced Christian expansion through fire and sword upon Slavic and pagan populations, converting by coercion, expelling entire communities, and replacing ancestral lands with brutalized order, and in the east again, among the fragmented khanates that followed the Mongol collapse, petty rulers enacted policies of tribute and taxation so severe that entire cities were depopulated, while in Serbia and the Balkan kingdoms, the oscillation between Christian and Ottoman domination saw kings who switched loyalties for survival, and executed suspected collaborators with gleeful excess, such as Stefan Lazarevic, whose literary court masked an authoritarian grasp that brooked no dissent, as bloodshed followed every change of alliance. And then there was Sigismund of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Hungary, whose reign was marked not only by extravagance and political failure, but by one of the most catastrophic events in European history, the Council of Constance and the betrayal and burning of Jan Hus, a preacher of reform whose martyrdom lit the fuse of religious revolution. And though Sigismund had promised Hus safe conduct, he allowed the church to violate that promise, setting the precedent that no heretic had rights, and sparking the Hussite wars that would devastate Bohemia for years to come, a ruler whose name became synonymous with duplicity, a man of endless ambition, who failed to hold a united Christendom together, even as it collapsed into schism and blood. And all across Poland and Lithuania, kings oscillated between enlightened unifiers and brutal destroyers, with rulers like Władysław II Jagiello expanding the kingdom through conversion and war, while internal persecutions against Jews, Orthodox Christians and pagans rose with each passing decade, often led or sanctioned by royal decree. And in these acts of state-sponsored violence, we see again the theme that defined the worst of medieval kingship. Not always the personal indulgence in sadism, but the systemic nature of the cruelty, where the institution of monarchy allowed or even encouraged mass suffering for the sake of divine mission, political gain, or simple pride. And nowhere was this perhaps clearer than under kings like Andrew II of Hungary, whose reign in the early 13th century drained the royal treasury through constant grants of land to powerful nobles in exchange for loyalty, bankrupting the crown and destabilizing the kingdom, while he crusaded in the Holy Land with such vanity and waste that he returned having achieved nothing except the ruin of his own court. and the nobility, emboldened by his weakness, issued the Golden Bull of 1222, a Hungarian Magna Carta that tried to curb royal abuses, but which he largely ignored, leading to decades of unrest, setting a precedent of contempt for limits that would haunt Hungary for generations. And over in Aragon, Peter IV, known as the Ceremonious, ruled with such obsession over court ritual and absolute control that he plunged his kingdom into repeated wars with his own subjects, crushing revolts not through negotiation but through decimation, his legacy preserved only in how tightly he clutched power, not how wisely he wielded it. And even in far-off realms like Georgia and Armenia, once centers of Christian learning and noble independence, local kings fell prey to madness, addiction, or the lure of despotic isolation, such as George VIII of Georgia, whose kingdom fragmented under his weak and paranoid rule. And finally, as we move toward the waning years of the medieval age, the figure of Richard II of England emerges like a tragic emblem of all that had gone wrong with divine monarchy, a boy king raised to believe in the absolute power of the crown, whose early reign was marked by the brutal suppression of the peasants' revolt in 1381, and who later surrounded himself with sycophants and favourites, ruling with increasing tyranny and paranoia, exiling or executing noble opponents, and plunging England into a crisis of legitimacy that would lead directly to the Wars of the Roses, a conflict born of dynastic pride, murder and betrayal that would reduce England to a chessboard of corpses and lost honour. And though Richard fancied himself a poet king, a new Arthur, in truth his reign ended in deposition, imprisonment, and probable starvation, a symbol of what happens when kings believe themselves gods. And thus across the vast, brutal expanse of the medieval world, from the snow-blasted highlands of Scotland to the burning deserts of the Levant, from the marble palaces of Byzantium to the forested castles of Saxony, terrible kings rose and fell like waves on a sea of blood, some mad, some cruel, some cowardly, some fanatical, and while their names remain carved in the stones of history, the true cost of their rule was paid by those who left no mark, whose bones littered the battlefields, who toiled in silence, who suffered in dungeons or died at the stake, who saw the crown not as a symbol of guidance but as an iron boot pressing down upon their necks. And though history sometimes redeems them with the passage of time, shaping them into cautionary tales, figures of folklore, or complex portraits of flawed leadership, we must never forget the pain their power inflicted, for to do so is to deny the voices of the voiceless, the millions who lived and died under their rule, their lives as real, as sacred, and as shattered as any relic in a royal chapel, their suffering the true legacy of the most terrible kings in medieval times. And yet as the sun set on the medieval world and the church bells tolled in cities draped with stone and fear, the era's litany of terrible kings still found echoes in the clamour of broken cities, the prayers of starving peasants, and the fearful silence of bloodied courtiers pacing long cold corridors. For while the age itself moved toward what scholars would later call the Renaissance, the closing chapters of medieval kingship delivered some of its most sinister legacies in rulers who clung to fading ideals of divine power while committing atrocities with a frequency and scale that surpassed their ancestors. And one of the most chilling examples came in the twilight of the 15th century in Bosnia, where Stephen Tomašević, the last king of that doomed realm, came to power amid swirling Ottoman pressure and internal betrayal. And though his rule was short, it was marked by desperate purges, political executions, and religious persecution against both Orthodox Christians and Muslims in a futile effort to present himself as a loyal Catholic monarch, hoping for help that never came. And when Mehmed the Conqueror's armies finally swept into Bosnia, Stephen was promised safety upon surrender, but was executed nonetheless, not before having butchered countless subjects under suspicion of collaboration, a tragic case of cruelty born from weakness. from fear, from the fatal knowledge that the crown he wore no longer held any power against the sword at his throat, and in that realization, he mirrored so many monarchs of that era, whose terror was not the confidence of tyrants, but the panic of dying dynasties, lashing out in suspicion and violence as the world shifted beneath them, and no figure represented this dissolution more starkly than Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who though not a king in title wielded kingly power and delusions in abundance, ruling as an autocrat with unbridled ambition and ruthlessness, engaging in wars of expansion that saw entire cities razed, prisoners massacred, and his own soldiers left to die in vain charges driven more by his pride than strategy, and in one of the bloodiest expressions of his folly, the Siege of Neuss in 1474, Charles laid waste to the countryside for 10 months, starving peasants and slaughtering rebels before being forced to withdraw, and later at Nancy in 1477, he would die alone, his body stripped and frozen in the snow, a fitting end for a man who ruled not by wisdom, but by fury, and yet still history often dresses such rulers in the finery of tragic grandeur, forgetting the shattered villages they left behind, the laws they suspended, the farmers conscripted and slaughtered for campaigns they never understood, and this pattern of cruelty followed by romanticism is a dangerous legacy of medieval kingship, for even those whose actions mirrored tyranny are sometimes remembered with nostalgic grandeur, such as Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, who built a reputation as a mighty king and lawgiver, but who also expelled all Jews from England in 1290, seizing their property, imposing brutal usury laws, and turning ethnic cleansing into crown policy, while also conducting a ruthless conquest of Wales and a brutal attempt at dominating Scotland, where he razed towns, executed nobles without trial, and turned abbeys into military garrisons. His justice swift and often arbitrary, yet lauded by later English monarchs as the embodiment of firm rule, showing how the brutal exercise of power could be rebranded as strength when viewed from the seat of privilege, and so too with Philip II Augustus of France, a monarch praised for his political reforms and military success, yet who expelled Jews in waves, seized their assets, and authorized inquisitions with glee, his court a place where theological terror mingled with administrative coldness, and while he may have broken the power of the English in Normandy, he ruled with an unflinching hand, seeing mercy as weakness and suspicion as prudence, and this cold, calculating despotism set the model for later monarchs like Louis the Manse, later canonized as a saint, though his actions included the forced burning of Jewish texts, religious pogroms, and the creation of structures for the persecution of heresy that would evolve into the full-blown medieval Inquisition. And one must not forget that the very concept of a saintly king was in itself a weapon, used to justify the worst excesses of piety turned violent, as in the Albigensian Crusade led by French kings and nobles, where entire towns in southern France were exterminated under the command of the crown, with instructions like "kill them all, God will know his own," echoing through the streets of Béziers and Carcassonne, as if the slaughter of tens of thousands could be sanctified by royal banners and papal approval. And these were not isolated incidents, but part of a culture of royal violence, where kings could act as both executioners and messiahs, often within the same breath, and in this the line between justice and vengeance, between order and terror, became fatally blurred, especially in Eastern Europe, where rulers like Sigismund Bathory of Transylvania attempted to impose absolutist control by selling off cities, betraying allies, and burning dissenters alive, his reign so unstable that it led to repeated abdications, returns and massacres, all while his people were caught in the grinder of Ottoman, Habsburg and internal pressure, a man whose inability to govern led him to lash out at the very foundation of his kingdom, proving again that terror does not require a strong king, only a desperate one. And in Denmark, even after the medieval period technically passed, the seeds sown by earlier kings like Erik Menved, who bankrupted the state through incessant wars and taxation, left the country so weakened that it took generations to recover, as his raids into German territories provoked counter-invasions, and his arbitrary arrests and executions of nobles laid the groundwork for endless domestic turmoil. And in Bohemia, kings like Ottokar II were so consumed with conquest and expansion that they neglected their own subjects, inviting revolt and instability that would later contribute to the Hussite upheaval, showing again that kings who prioritized empire over people often sowed the very chaos they claimed to prevent. And in such a world, it is little wonder that entire populations turned toward messianic movements and violent rebellion, for when the king became the tormentor, the only salvation was found in fire and sword. In the rise of figures like Wat Tyler or Jan Žižka, who defied the crown not with diplomacy but with righteous rage, leading armies of peasants and fanatics who had known only the lash, the tax collector, and the noose. And while these rebellions were often crushed, they served as the only available voice for a people whose suffering was otherwise rendered invisible in the gilded chronicles and self-serving charters of royal courts. And even in those rare cases where kings began as reformers, like Alfonso XI of Castile, who attempted legal reforms and centralized authority, one still finds the shadows of authoritarianism, for even Alfonso ordered the massacre of the Jews of Toledo in 1348, when fear of plague and superstition ran high, and his own court was rife with favoritism, murder, and intrigue, suggesting that even the best-intentioned kings could be swept up in the tides of medieval fear, prejudice, and absolute authority. And all these stories, drawn from castles, crypts, court records, and the aching songs of the dispossessed, speak not only to the character of individual rulers, but to the danger of the institution itself. For a crown not bound by law, not checked by assembly or conscience, becomes not a symbol of unity, but a blade at the neck of the realm. And time and again this was proved in the blood of cities burned, families broken, heretics hunted, and justice perverted, until at last the age of such kings began to pass, replaced not by peace, but by a new kind of cruelty, bureaucratic and colonial, yet no less terrible. And the medieval kings, those mad, brutal, vain and cowardly lords, left behind a world marked by their choices, by their need to dominate, and their terror of dissent, a world that still bears the scars of their rule, in the names of vanished villages, in the ruins of rebel strongholds, in the silent prayers of forgotten martyrs, and in the history books where their crimes are too often softened by time and myth, when in truth they were not kings of legend, but kings of agony, and the tale of their reign is not one of glory, but a dirge of suffering echoed in the stone and soil of 1,000 battered kingdoms. And as the brutal procession of monarchs continued into the late medieval period, the nature of tyranny evolved, yet its consequences remained as catastrophic as ever. For where once a king's cruelty was expressed in swordplay and dungeons, by the 15th century it was increasingly cloaked in policy, charters, alliances, and bureaucracies crafted to ensure loyalty through fear. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the fragmented Italian states, where the so-called enlightened despots of city-states like Milan, Naples, and Florence displayed the terrifying blend of cultural patronage and ruthless suppression that defined the new breed of terrible rulers, with none more emblematic of this than Ludovico Sforza of Milan, the de facto ruler who engineered his way to power by poisoning his nephew, usurping the rightful heir, and instituting a reign of elaborate court intrigue, where artists like Leonardo da Vinci painted in golden salons, while spies whispered in shadowed corridors, and suspected traitors vanished into the damp oubliettes beneath the Castello Sforzesco, and Ludovico's decisions to invite the French into Italy, to betray allies, to shift his allegiance with the wind, would not only plunge Milan into chaos, but spark the Italian wars that devastated the peninsula for decades, bringing wave after wave of foreign armies that pillaged, raped, and burned across Renaissance Italy, turning one of Europe's most sophisticated regions into a killing field. And his reign, like so many of the era, was built on silencing rivals, starving peasants, and turning cities into palaces of fear cloaked in silk. And if Ludovico was the artist tyrant, then Sigismondo Malatesta of Rimini was the beast in human form, a lord so ferocious and deranged that even the Pope excommunicated him not just for heresy, but for crimes against humanity, accusing him of incest, sorcery, torture, and the systematic destruction of churches and holy men. And though such charges may have been exaggerated by enemies, the documented facts are chilling enough. The brutal flaying of enemies, the desecration of holy relics, and his alleged commission of a temple not to God but to his own dead mistress, filled with pagan symbols, and his reign remains a stark testament to the idea that cultural refinement and sadistic power often dwelt hand in hand. And across the Alps in France, the later Valois kings, especially Charles VII and Louis XI, while building stronger states, did so at the cost of thousands of lives and the suppression of entire classes of citizens, crushing local independence in cities like Orléans and Dijon with deadly efficiency, all while levying ever higher taxes and creating a permanent military class that would enable future kings to wage wars of conquest and suppression without ever seeking the approval of nobles or commons. And though this seemed to promise national unity, it was built on the bones of autonomy and the silenced cries of regional resistance. And in England, as the Wars of the Roses dragged the land into cycles of civil war, betrayal, and dynastic ambition, figures like Margaret of Anjou and the Dukes of York and Lancaster unleashed armies upon their own people, leading to battles like Towton, where tens of thousands died in a single day, their corpses frozen in fields, their blood mingling with snow, not for cause or justice, but for titles and succession. And as kings like Edward IV rose on the tide of such slaughter, they often enforced order through executions, land seizures, and shadow trials, declaring enemies traitors with little more than a signature. And though Edward presented himself as a warrior king and patron of learning, his reign was one of brutal consolidation, and his brother Richard III would take that tyranny to a more infamous height, seizing the crown through the mysterious disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, and ruling with an iron will that alienated even his allies, until he was finally defeated and killed at Bosworth, his body hacked apart and buried without ceremony, a fitting end for a monarch whose brief reign is still debated, some painting him a reformer, others a monster. Yet the facts of his usurpation and ruthlessness remain as cold as the tower stones that may have buried his final victims. And in the east, as the Ottoman Empire rose to eclipse Byzantium, its early sultans engaged in acts of dynastic fratricide, so horrific that new sultans were expected to strangle their own brothers upon accession, sometimes including infants. And while this was institutionalized as a way to prevent civil war, the moral cost was incalculable, turning the court into a place of whispers, silk cords, and muffled cries behind locked doors. And as the Ottomans absorbed former Christian territories, the last Byzantine emperors, like Constantine XI, faced impossible decisions, ruling hollowed-out realms from palaces surrounded by enemies, forced to execute suspected traitors even as the walls crumbled, their rule remembered with tragic grandeur, but lived in paranoia and fear. And farther north in Muscovy, the roots of Tsarist absolutism were already being sown, as Ivan III centralized power in ways that stripped ancient freedoms from the boyars and the peasantry, laying the groundwork groundwork for the later horrors of Ivan IV, the Terrible, whose tortures, purges, and genocidal campaigns would become legend, but whose ideological ancestry lay in the medieval belief that the monarch was God's shadow on earth. Unquestionable, unchallengeable, and often unhinged, and even in lands often seen as more stable, like the kingdoms of Portugal or Scotland, kings like James I of Scotland proved how quickly a monarch could transform from reformer to tyrant, initiating good governance and legal codification, while also executing rivals, imposing martial law, and provoking his own assassination by nobles who had grown weary of his overreach, and his murder in a sewer beneath a monastery while bathing is a grim footnote to a reign that began with promise but ended in resentment and blood. And in Portugal, the period following the death of King Ferdinand IV led to the 1385 crisis, during which various factions seized power and violence between nobles, commoners, and foreign powers turned cities like Lisbon into arenas of mob justice and royal vengeance, where suspected collaborators were hung from windows and skinned in marketplaces, where the absence of a strong heir led not to liberty but to nightmare, proving again that the vacuum left by failed kings could be just as bloody as their presence. And if all these examples seem to blur into one unending nightmare of crowns and cruelty, it is because the pattern repeated with such grim regularity that the exceptions, those rare just kings, stand out not as the rule, but as almost miraculous anomalies in a world where power almost inevitably corrupted, where the weight of the crown seemed to deform the very souls of those who wore it, bending their humanity into cruelty, their dreams into suspicion, and their legacies into fire. And yet even in their downfall, these kings often dragged thousands with them, as their mistakes triggered wars, famines, economic collapse, and religious persecution on scales that modern minds struggle to fathom. For every failed tax policy led to peasant revolts crushed with fire, every bungled alliance led to sieges where entire populations were starved into cannibalism, and every paranoid execution of a noble led to vendettas that spanned generations. And through it all, the people, the vast voiceless mass of medieval humanity, suffered in silence or rebellion, their stories preserved only in the margins of chronicles or the mass graves unearthed centuries later, their pain the silent evidence of monarchs whose power was unchecked and often monstrous. And as we look back across that span of centuries, it becomes clear that the most terrible kings of medieval times were not merely villains of their age, but architects of generational trauma, their whims echoing through laws, borders, ruins, and myths, their sins carved not only in stone but into the memories of nations, reminding us that power without accountability, no matter how splendid the robes or how sacred the coronation, leads only to horror, and that the crown, for all its glittering majesty, has often masked a blade poised against the very people it claimed to serve. And yet the story does not end with the fall of one tyrant or the assassination of another, because the cycle of cruelty disguised as kingship was perpetuated by institutions and ideologies that enabled these men, born of noble blood or crowned by chance, to govern not through wisdom but through fear. And nowhere is this seen more tragically than in the case of John of Bohemia's descendants, for though John himself was considered valiant, his legacy as part of the Luxembourg dynasty paved the way for the feckless rule of his grandson Wenceslaus I, who, despite being crowned King of the Romans and King of Bohemia, ruled with such staggering ineptitude and indifference that he became a case study in the perils of weak leadership, masquerading as royal authority. For Wenceslaus's tendency to drink, to vanish into the woods for days at a time, to ignore state affairs, and to lash out violently at court officials who questioned him led not only to domestic instability but to religious tensions that helped set the stage for the Bohemian Reformation and eventually the devastating Hussite Wars. And under his reign, the persecution of dissenters became sporadic and capricious, resulting in mobs acting in his name without royal oversight, which is perhaps even more dangerous than declared tyranny, for in that vacuum of true authority, the aristocracy and clergy often unleashed purges of their own design, and while Wenceslas was eventually deposed from the imperial throne, he clung to Bohemia until his death, leaving behind a kingdom fragmented by war, corruption, and sectarian hate, all because a crown had been placed on the head of a man who could neither rule nor be ruled. And in Hungary too, the tradition of cruel kings carried on in the person of Charles I's descendants, including Sigismund of Luxembourg, a monarch whose career was marked by endless wars and shifting allegiances, most notably his role in organizing the Crusade of Nicopolis, a catastrophic military campaign that ended in one of the worst defeats for Christian Europe in the late Middle Ages, as the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid Afray crushed the crusading army, took thousands of prisoners, and ordered the execution of countless knights and common soldiers alike. And though Sigismund escaped, his arrogant miscalculations and diplomatic missteps cost the lives of tens of thousands and accelerated Ottoman expansion into Europe. And he later presided over the Council of Constance, where he sanctioned the execution of Jan Hus, a reformer who had come under safe conduct to debate theological matters, only to be seized, imprisoned, and burned at the stake. A betrayal so blatant that it shattered any trust reformers held in the Church or the Holy Roman Empire, and led directly to decades of rebellion, religious war, and death. And so Sigismund, like so many of his ilk, ruled not by offering justice or reform, but by cloaking his acts of terror in the robes of divine order and orthodoxy. And beyond the imperial and royal courts, local lords given autonomy by absentee monarchs often created miniature realms of horror that mirrored their sovereigns in brutality, but not in grandeur, such as the barons of the Baltic states, Germanic knights who operated like warlords, extorting tithes, conscripting peasants into private armies, and using monasteries not as centers of faith, but as fortresses from which to launch raids and suppress revolts. And among the worst was Hermann von Salza's successors in the Teutonic Order, whose crusades against the pagan Lithuanians turned into decades of genocide, forced conversions, and economic devastation across Eastern Europe, all justified under the language of holy war. And with every victory, the order imposed strict feudal structures, enslaved native populations, and built castles not to defend but to dominate, casting long shadows over the forests and lakes of the Baltic lands. And though these knights wore crosses and chanted psalms, their actions spoke of conquest, greed, and terror more than faith, and their rule left scars so deep that resistance continued for generations. And in a darker twist of irony, some monarchs who inherited the sins of others became monsters not by birth, but by necessity, shaped by the violence they were born into, and the expectations forced upon them, as in the case of Charles VI of France, a king who began his reign with promise, but was slowly driven mad, suffering from what we now recognize as severe mental illness, leading him to forget his identity, attack his servants, flee from his own wife, and refuse to bathe or change clothes. And in the absence of his mind, his court descended into factional chaos, with the powerful Burgundian and Armagnac parties waging civil war in the name of a king who no longer ruled himself. And this internal collapse left France vulnerable to the English during the 100 Years' War. And as Henry V of England triumphed at Agincourt and demanded the French crown through the Treaty of Troyes, Charles became a puppet, a tragic symbol of how mental fragility could doom a nation, and how the fiction of royal infallibility led to horror when the body wearing the crown no longer knew what a crown was. And even England's triumphant Henry V was not without his own shades of tyranny, for his campaigns in France were marked by scorched earth policies, the slaughter of prisoners, and the forced relocation of populations. And though history often paints him as the golden warrior king, his methods ensured that even as he advanced, the countryside behind him burned, the people starved, and the fragile truce between English lords and commoners at home was maintained only through the illusion of foreign conquest and divine favour. And when his young son Henry VI inherited the throne, the illusion shattered, for Henry VI, deeply pious and gentle, was utterly unfit to rule a kingdom that required iron will and cunning, and his passivity in the face of noble ambition led directly to the Wars of the Roses, one of the most destructive civil conflicts in English history. And though Henry VI was not cruel himself, his inability to prevent cruelty made him complicit. For in medieval kingship, weakness was often as deadly as malice, and thousands died because he could not stop his barons from using the land as their chessboard. And as the smoke of battle settled over Towton, Barnet and Tewkesbury, the cycle continued, with each new king rising from the bodies of the last, and always the people, the merchants, the serfs, the craftsmen, paid in blood and bread for the ambitions of the few. And beyond the Christian world, in regions like Georgia and Armenia, the collapse of royal houses under Mongol pressure led to local tyrants taking control, imposing taxes beyond reason, and selling their own citizens into slavery to pay tribute to overlords who demanded only obedience and silver. And these vassal kings, puppets draped in royal trappings, often competed in cruelty to prove loyalty, executing dissenters, punishing villagers for harboring rebels, and turning ancient lands of culture and learning into war-torn borderlands. And in the fractured remains of the once mighty Abbasid Caliphate, regional sultans and emirs proclaimed kingship with swords instead of legitimacy, and figures like the Mamluk sultans, though defenders of Islam against the Mongols and Crusaders, often ruled through military courts, slave armies, and brutal crackdowns. And one could argue that their form of kingship, born in barracks and forged in campaigns, was never meant to be just or noble, but merely effective. Yet even they were sometimes overshadowed by the cruelty of their own lieutenants, who in the Sultan's name tortured tax collectors who fell short, amputated limbs for petty theft, or burned alive entire neighborhoods accused of sedition. And in every kingdom, every court, from Iberia to Persia, from the steppes of Russia to the mountains of the Caucasus, the tale repeats itself. Kings raised to believe they were God's anointed, empowered by swords, sacraments, and sycophants, turning suspicion into law, anger into decree, and failure into crusade. And though songs may have praised their victories and chroniclers gilded their triumphs, the earth remembers their reigns differently, through the shattered walls of cities that resisted, through the abandoned fields of villages razed for rebellion, through the ghostly silence of roads where peasants once walked, and now only the wind moves among forgotten bones. And thus the story of the most terrible kings in medieval times is not the tale of a few bad men among many good, but a recurring nightmare in which power unbound by accountability becomes monstrous, and the people, always the people, bear its cost in silence, in exile and in graves. And so the shadow of tyranny did not wane with the end of one century and the dawn of another, for across the breadth of medieval Europe, the grip of kings who ruled with iron cruelty continued to tighten as new crowns were forged, not to protect but to dominate. And in this pattern of despotism, few names cast a more dreadful pall than that of Ivan IV of Russia, known forever as Ivan the Terrible, whose reign, while extending slightly beyond the medieval threshold into the early modern period, was so drenched in the blood of his own people and so emblematic of medieval-style autocracy that to omit him would be to ignore one of history's most chilling examples of how absolute power contorts the human soul. For Ivan began his rule as a child tormented by the corruption and indifference of the boyar aristocracy, growing into a man filled with paranoia, vengeance, and unrelenting wrath. And his early reforms, which promised centralization, justice, and modernization, were quickly overtaken by his descent into madness, culminating in the formation of the Oprichnina, a secret police force and terror regime that was unleashed upon the nobility and citizenry alike, with thousands tortured, executed, or exiled on accusations of treason or sorcery, and entire towns, like Novgorod, massacred under the pretext of conspiracy, as Ivan rode into cities cloaked in black robes alongside his mounted executioners, their dogs trained to maul suspected traitors, and as the rivers turned red and forests echoed with the screams of the accused, Ivan prayed in his cathedrals and claimed divine sanction for his deeds, convinced that he alone held the fate of Russia in his blood-stained hands, and in the ultimate act of personal tragedy and horror, in a fit of uncontrollable rage and mistrust, he struck and killed his own son and heir, sealing not just the fate of his dynasty, but the future of his people, who would descend into the time of troubles, a period of famine, invasion, and civil war so devastating that even peasants whispered his name with dread for generations. And further west, in the fragmented realms of Italy, despots known as signori ruled over city-states with equal cruelty, though far more polish. For men like Ezzelino da Romano of Padua wielded power with a scholar's mind and a butcher's hand, establishing private prisons in which enemies were blinded, burned, or starved to death. And it is said that he delighted in creative tortures, once building a tower solely for the purpose of tossing rebels to their deaths, while musicians played to drown the screams, and though he commissioned churches and supported the arts, the blood on his soul could never be washed clean, and Florence too would eventually fall under the iron will of tyrants disguised as republicans, as men like Walter of Brienne used noble titles and foreign troops to seize control, only to be chased out by uprisings born of despair and fury. And yet the most notorious Italian ruler of this mould may be Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, whose ruthless campaigns to conquer Romagna and central Italy were a study in Machiavellian politics before Machiavelli ever penned his infamous treatise. And Cesare, handsome, intelligent, and utterly without mercy, used assassination, bribery, and open war to destroy rival families, poison allies, and claim city after city, hanging their governors' bodies in public squares as warnings. And though admired for his daring and vision, his fall was swift and brutal when fortune turned, leaving the lands he had pacified to once again erupt in chaos. And so the legacy of these lords was not the stability they promised, but the fear they cultivated. The brief moments of order built atop layers of corpses and cries, and in the far reaches of Central Europe, in the mountainous kingdoms of Wallachia and Transylvania, one figure would rise who has haunted human memory in myth and legend as no other, Vlad the Dracula, known as Vlad the Impaler, whose very name conjures images of pikes and forests of the dead, and though his resistance against the encroaching Ottoman Empire earned him a degree of reverence among his own people, the methods by which he defended his land, impaling tens of thousands of enemies and civilians alike, skinning traitors alive, boiling thieves, and arranging the corpses of entire villages in geometrically precise death gardens, rendered him less a king and more a nightmare-given flesh, and accounts from foreign diplomats and merchants describe scenes of such horror that birds refused to land and wolves howled for days. And though some may argue that his cruelty was a necessary response to the times, a defensive bulwark against greater powers, his enjoyment of torment and public spectacles of death reveal a man whose rule was not only about security but control through psychological terror, and his legacy, later twisted into the vampire lore of Bram Stoker, remains rooted in real violence, a reminder of what monarchs will do when the world allows them to cloak terror in the name of sovereignty. And across the seas in medieval Africa and the Middle East, kings of similar disposition reigned with unchecked cruelty, such as the Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, who, though hailed for architectural splendor and military victories, also executed dozens of his own emirs in orchestrated purges and let famine and plague ravage the countryside while courtly feasts continued. And in the Songhai Empire, the late reign of Askia Dawood, weakened by succession disputes and internal paranoia, gave rise to ministers who used royal authority to punish rivals, enslave citizens, and confiscate lands, turning the once thriving cities of Timbuktu and Gao into places of suspicion and secrecy. And even as Islamic jurisprudence called for justice and restraint, kings and caliphs alike found ways to interpret divine will as justification for vengeance, and so across continents, cultures and creeds, the terrible king remained a universal figure, a constant in a time when divinity and monarchy were fused into one terrible symbol, and the peasants in their fields, the scribes in their towers, the monks in their cloisters, all knew the weight of a bad king's reign could outlast even his life, lingering in broken laws, fractured institutions, and the memory of what power untethered from mercy can destroy. And thus the tale of the most terrible kings of medieval times is not merely a tale of monsters among men, but of men made monsters by belief, by tradition, by inheritance, and by a world that rewarded domination with divinity. And until the last chains of this thinking were broken, until the people could whisper freely of justice without fear of death, the crown would remain not a symbol of unity, but of a single man's will, enforced by steel, silence, and the blood of thousands. And yet, even as the centuries passed and the architecture of monarchies evolved, the spectre of the terrible king continued to loom, a grotesque constant in the unfolding tableau of medieval life. For the concept of divine right, that God himself had chosen certain men to wield absolute power, remained a potent and dangerous justification for cruelty. And among the darkest figures to rule under this premise was King Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad, whose reign was not so much defined by tyranny in the classic sense, but by a madness that turned the Kingdom of France into a house of horrors, where incompetence, paranoia, and delusion reigned as surely as any executioner. For Charles, plagued by intermittent bouts of psychosis, once forgot his own name, attacked his servants with a sword in a frenzy, and spent months convinced he was made of glass and might shatter if touched, while the nobility around him feasted, plotted, and warred, manipulating the regency for power, ignoring the suffering of the peasants, and letting the 100 Years' War rage on like an endless fever dream. And while the king's mind unravelled, the people starved, the lands burned, and France teetered on the edge of annihilation. And though Charles may have been a victim of disease more than villainy, the consequences of his rule were no less devastating than the actions of kings who wielded cruelty with intent. For the madness of a sovereign, unchecked and unchallenged, was as deadly as the blade of any tyrant. And across the sea in England, history would record similar horrors in the lives of monarchs who cloaked incompetence in ceremony, among them King John, whose reign was so disastrous that his own barons rebelled and forced the Magna Carta upon him, not out of any love for freedom, but sheer desperation at his greed, his failures in war, and his brutal taxes which squeezed the life out of merchants, clergy, and commoners alike. And this was a king who extorted wealth from widows and orphans, who starved prisoners to death, including his own nephew Arthur, a legitimate rival for the throne, whose mysterious murder in captivity would darken John's name forever, and whose petty wars with the church led to England being excommunicated, its spiritual life severed by a man more interested in coin than kingdom, and even when he died, gasping and fevered, his last act was a failed military campaign that left the realm divided and bleeding, and so great was his infamy that chroniclers of the age agreed he was a tyrant more foul than any to wear the crown. And yet John was not alone in his cruelty among the English kings, for Edward II too proved a monarch whose personal indulgences, military ineptitude, and disastrous favouritism led to humiliation at the hands of the Scots, political chaos, and eventually his own gruesome death. Imprisoned, humiliated, and allegedly murdered with a red-hot poker in a manner so vile, it seemed like a tale from hell rather than history, and it was not merely their cruelty that made these kings terrible, but their betrayal of what kingship was supposed to mean, for the people suffered not just under sword and flame, but from the betrayal of justice, the corruption of honour, and the destruction of hope. And far to the north, in the cold kingdoms of Scandinavia, King Eric of Pomerania ruled the Kalmar Union with an arrogance and brutality that alienated the Danes, Swedes and Norwegians alike, raising taxes to wage endless wars, ignoring famines, and imposing foreign administrators who treated the local nobility with contempt, until rebellion swept across the Union like a wind-driven fire, and Eric, too proud to yield, fled into exile, living as a pirate king along the Baltic Sea, his former subjects now his prey, a bitter echo of the arrogance that had destroyed a throne meant to unite the North. And in Hungary, King Bela IV, though often remembered for rebuilding after the Mongol invasion, enacted harsh land confiscations and forced labour, punishing entire regions for perceived disloyalty and reshaping society not through healing but through conquest and consolidation, sowing seeds of resentment that would echo long after his death. And in the Balkan lands, despots, such as Tsar Ivan Shishman of Bulgaria, presided over disintegrating realms, retreating into fortress cities while the people faced Ottoman advance and local nobles turned brigand, and rather than galvanizing resistance, these rulers hoarded wealth, executed rivals, and allowed the bonds of loyalty to dissolve in their hands like ash in water, and so too did the Christian kingdoms of Spain during the long struggle of the Reconquista, raise up kings who in their lust for unity and purity sanctioned unspeakable acts, such as Peter of Castile, called both the cruel and the just, depending on who wrote the tale, who famously executed his enemies without trial, turned his brother into a bitter foe, and slaughtered nobles under cover of reconciliation. His rule so fraught with betrayal and vengeance that it fractured the nobility, provoked civil war, and led to his grisly murder in a tent, stabbed by his half-brother while calling for mercy, and though some remembered him for defending the rights of Jews and the common folk, his name was forever stained by the blood of those he deceived and destroyed, and all these kings in their madness, cruelty, or incompetence became the architects of their own kingdom's ruin, for a king without mercy becomes a wolf among lambs, and a king without wisdom becomes a blind man at the helm of a storm-racked ship. And thus the medieval world, for all its saints and scholars, its builders and poets, was never free from the grip of terrible kings, men who shaped the lives of millions with a single decree, who could order mass executions before a morning meal or bankrupt cities to build tombs for themselves. And though some were born into horror and others chose it, the legacy they left was the same: broken oaths, burned villages, weeping mothers, and a history written in lamentation and blood. And this was the cost of sovereignty, unrestrained by law or compassion, and it is why, centuries later, their names remain, not in honour, but as warnings, whispered still in the bones of castles and in the echo of ruined chapels where the innocent once prayed for deliverance that never came.